Okay, in the final part of this lesson on the origins of civilizations, we're going to talk about the issue of cultural differentiation. So at the beginning of the lesson, I talked about how there's both a centripetal effect and a centrifugal effect. There's a centripetal effect making people come together in societies with common culture and identity, but there's also a centrifugal effect creating differences among groups. And we've largely been talking about the centripetal effects, the things that cause people to come together and share a common culture, common practices, common ideas, common outlooks on life. Well, now we need to turn our attention to cultural differentiation and consider what the forces are that cause civilizations or other social groups to differentiate themselves from each other and have a feeling of difference rather than shared way of thinking about the world. So we said that cooperation comes from interaction. But that's not necessarily true. That's only true if cooperation is beneficial. So it could be, for example, if people are thinking about bringing in the harvest before it is eaten by the birds or before the crop spoils, in that case, cooperation is beneficial because everybody is needed to bring in the harvest, and if they all work together, they can get it in quickly. But if it's a situation where people are relying on fish in a lake, then having more people doesn't really help. In fact, it just creates more pressure on the fish in the lake. So you don't really want other people because, you know, for every fish that I eat, that's one less available for you, and vice versa. So whether cooperation comes from interaction depends on whether there is a sense of a mutual need for other people, whether there's a dependency on other people, whether there is what Gumilyov called complementarity. If that's the case, then yes, cooperation will emerge. But if there is differences of interests, then cooperation is not likely to emerge, and actually the opposite. So we can say that if we have interacting populations, the outcome is going to depend on whether they have shared interests or opposed interests. In the case of shared interests, yes, we will get cooperation. But in the case of opposed interests, we'll have competition. Between the interacting peoples. And so in the cooperative case, we can develop a common culture. But in the competitive case, we're not going to do that. We're going to develop different cultures. So this is in fact a bit different from what people often assume. You know, if you look in archaeology books, it quite often says that the cultural diversity of the world arose because humans spread out across the globe and lost touch with each other, and so their cultures diverged. But in fact, when people spread out across the world and lost touch with each other, there was no pressure to develop a different culture. yes, there might be some vague, or slow cultural drift, but there was no reason to do things differently. And as we've seen, cultural practices are likely to be stable equilibrium points and therefore quite robust against change. If you're driving on the left and your society moves somewhere else in the planet, even if it loses touch with the original one, you're likely to carry on driving on the left because that's the way everybody else is still doing it. There's no reason why you would switch to the right. So the idea that cultures change by being out of touch is seemingly not correct. It's actually when they're in touch that they're more likely to feel the need to differentiate themselves if they're in touch but in a competitive situation. So we could say, in fact, if you look back through through archaeology to early times, we do actually see common culture over vast different distances. Ways of chipping flint tools and things were shared over large areas. And we could say that it's only later that, as the world filled up, that people started to feel a bit of pressure on the resources, that now there was a bit of concern whether there was enough to go round. So people had to be more clear about, hey, this is ours and that's yours. And so people started to cooperate together against the other groups and say, hey, this is our groups. So people needed to advertise their group membership. It was to show the group to which they belonged, so they adopted the same practices of the rest of their group to which they belonged, but also they made their cultural practices different from the other group, so they could be clear that we're with them, we're not with you, and you are you and we are us. So it was, as I say, when there was interaction in the or that it was increased interaction that actually caused cultural difference to arise. When there wasn't much interaction, there wasn't much feeling of pressure to change your culture. But when you were starting to feel that there's finite resources, we're competing with other groups for these resources, that was the time that you started to become more conscious of advertising which group you belong to through cultural and linguistic differences. And a sort of simple example of that might be if you've got a group of friends who get together just to have a kickabout of football, then they don't need to dress up. They can just wear any old thing because they're all on the same side and they're just having fun. It's only when you go on Sunday to play a match against another team, that's when you put on your football strip to advertise, which team you belong to. So it is, when the group is isolated, there's no pressure for developing this strong identity. But when in contrast to other groups, but when you're interacting with those other people, that is when you start to construct these differences. And some examples of that. One is the case of language change or accent change on Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard, an island off the coast of Massachusetts, which became a popular holiday destination, particularly in the 50s and 60s, and from then on. A linguist studying the local people of Martha's Vineyard observed how at the beginning of his study their accent was very similar to the people on the mainland, but as Martha's Vineyard became attracted more and more tourists during the summer, the locals started to pronounce certain words or certain vowels in a different way. And this was, the interpretation was that this is how they differentiated themselves, saying, hey, I'm a local, I'm not one of these tourists. So the desire to be different, it comes first. The Martha's Vineyarders wanted to show, hey, we are locals, and so they then constructed the difference. It's not that the cultural difference exists first, and that makes a feeling of opposition between people and hostility. No, the feeling of opposition is there first. There's a reason why you want to feel different, and so you construct cultural and linguistic differences to advertise that fact. Another example is some work that's been done on eavesdropping, and how when people feel that they're eavesdropping, how when people feel that others who are not necessarily friendly to them are listening in, they change the way they talk to make it less comprehensible to the people listening in. And a classic example of that is criminals who have a slang so that, if the police are listening into them, they can't understand what they're talking about. Now, in that case, you could say it's a practical difference, but the same kind of thing occurs, for example, with Cockney rhyming slang. Apples and pears meaning the stairs, and trouble and strife meaning wife. And this is not so much about confusing other people, but it's about showing, hey, I'm a Cockney, I'm a local, I'm one of our group. Yes, when others listening in, you're trying to advertise to your group, you are one of them. Another example is a phenomenon of what we might call cultural revitalization, which occurs when people are suddenly challenged, their identity is challenged. This particularly occurred with the spread of Europeans through the world into places like North America. The ghost dance phenomenon is an example of it, where the local tribes sort of reasserted the purest form of their original culture because they felt challenged by these outsiders coming in, seemingly more advanced. Their response was to reinforce their own sense of identity. And you see the same kind of thing with, by emphasizing those, unique cultural behaviors that were specific to them. And you can see the same kind of thing with sometimes with political parties after losing an election. They often kind of go back to their roots, reassert their core values, which is arguably counterproductive because it's that reason they didn't get elected. But there's this kind of feeling after the sort of disappointment and challenge to your identity of losing the election to reassert who you are and reinforce your sense of difference from those nasty other people who won the election instead. I mean, we see this, an example is the UK Labour Party after they lost the election in 1979. They elected Michael Foot, who was, very much on the harder left side of the party and an old Labour type. And it took a long time for them to move away from that and modernise and be able to come back to the centre and start winning elections again. So again, it's a case of challenge, a feeling of competition, a feeling of pressure causes you to strengthen your differences from the other side and reassert your core identity and values. Another example is that how societies often get the name from outsiders. So the Phoenicians, for example, that name was given to them by the Greeks. When societies are more isolated, they often don't really have a clear name for themselves. Their name is just something like humans or the folk. That's that's all they call themselves. They're just people. But it's when they interact with other groups that they start to have to construct an identity for themselves and give themselves a name and become more conscious of who they are, and so that they are something different from the other people. So again, cultural differentiation coming from interaction, a sense of who we are, what our culture is, what our mental outlook is. Another possible interesting consequence of this is that cultural diversity increases towards the equator. And an argument as to why this is that towards the equator life is easier. There's more energy coming from the sun for a start, so there's greater biodiversity, there's greater energy available, and this means that smaller groups are viable. In fact, they say the biodiversity also increases towards the equator for similar reason, that smaller animal populations are viable towards the equator. Because of the life being easier towards the equator, more abundant energy throughput in the ecosystem, and so that with the cultures, smaller human groups can survive. So when there's opportunity for smaller groups to be smaller, then those groups not only exist in smaller sizes, but they develop their own unique cultures to keep the difference between them and the other groups. So this is why cultural diversity increases, smaller groups, but insisting on constructing cultural difference. And then there are some possible counterexamples. But these are instructive because they're kind of illustrations of how the exception proves the rule. So one seeming counterexample, is Papua New Guinea. This is one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse parts of the planet. But as interaction is increasing now, as it's modernizing, roads, cities appearing, people moving further afield, linguistic cultural diversity is decreasing. So this might seem to be a contradiction of the idea that it's the interaction of populations that leads to cultural difference. In the past, when they were small and self-contained, they were more diverse, and as they've now start to interact more, they're becoming less diverse. That seems to be the opposite of what I've been saying. But in fact, it could be considered actually an example of it. It was that before, when they were all small and self-contained, there's a lot of war between neighbouring tribes, and there was no mutual dependency. So in that situation, each local tribe constructed a sense of difference from its neighbours through cultural and linguistic differentiation. But now, as Papua New Guinea modernises, people interact further afield, they are establishing more mutual dependency on other people. Their lifestyles now don't just depend upon their little local village, because they're becoming richer, more complex, and so they're interacting with people further away, and they have a mutual interest of successfully interacting with those people. So it's this example, they're building shared interests over wider areas, and so cooperation is increasing. And that seems to be a general principle that as social complexity increases, that's supposed to be an up arrow, as social complexity increases, cultural diversity decreases, or particularly linguistic diversity decreases. And it is because of what we're saying, that as a society becomes more complex, people have to interact more with other people. Their lifestyle depends on larger numbers of other people in what were formerly other groups, and so they have less need to emphasize difference because they're no longer competitive with them. They're actually mutually dependent on them. They're more into the cooperative situation. Another, what would seem to be counterexample, is from the ancient Near East. The fact that Assyria and Babylonia were constantly at war with each other. There was a lot of conflict over the centuries between them, and yet they spoke the same language, just different dialects of the same language. So we might say here, well, if they were fighting each other all the time, they're obviously in a competitive situation. They obviously desired to be different. Perhaps they should have established greater diversity. You wouldn't expect them to speak the same language. Well, yes, but maybe what we should emphasize here is that they did speak different dialects. So maybe that is enough to establish that sense of difference. It was still advertising which was which. And if we look at that whole area of the ancient Near East, over the thousands of years, it was a cultural kaleidoscope, many different societies, tribes, empires coming and going. And to this day, there are many different tribes there. So it shows that despite thousands of years of interaction, that doesn't necessarily create cooperation. If there's a sufficient competition, then those differences can and will persist. And perhaps one final point on this is that we notice that wars tend to break out at cultural boundaries. Conflict is higher at cultural boundaries, the same way as it's higher, the earthquakes break out where tectonic plates are interacting. So, an example, the Ukraine, where two cultural identities meet, or India, Pakistan. War is particularly likely at cultural boundaries that are ill-defined, where it's still, there's a competitive situation and it's still not clear what resources belong to which group. In that case, there's, most likely to be conflict over securing for one group or the other the available resources. So when there's cultural boundaries that still lack clarity, that is when you're most likely to see war. But the point being, anyway, that it's cultural differences exist not a priori and that are the cause of the war, but actually it's the competition that is creating competition over resources or territory or whatever it might be, and that is expressed through the perpetuation of cultural differences. And a final illustration of this point is that wars tend to occur at cultural boundaries, the same way that earthquakes occur where tectonic plates meet. And wars are particularly likely at cultural boundaries that are ill-defined, where people are mixed up still. So it's not clear, what resources, what territory belongs to this group and what belongs to that group. So we might say that wars occur at cultural boundaries because people from different cultures just hate each other. But the things we've been discussing suggests it's kind of the other way around. It's not that people from different cultures naturally fight each other. It's that people are fighting each other because they're in competition over territory or resources. And then it's that sense of competition that is expressed through the perpetuation of cultural difference.